Welcome, coin hunters and history lovers. Today, we're taking a fascinating journey through American coinage as we explore four of the most valuable and expensive Washington quarter dollars ever discovered. These may look like ordinary pieces of pocket change, but hidden dates, mint marks, rare varieties, striking errors, and extraordinary condition can transform a simple quarter into a serious collector's treasure. From the silver era to the modern age, each coin has a story of rarity, history, and incredible value. So stay with us, because one of these Washington quarters might be worth far more than its 25-cent face value, and you may even have something similar hiding in an old collection, jar, or drawer. Let's begin the hunt. Let's get started. Fast up to in there are some American coins that become fascinating because they were produced in tiny numbers, and then there are coins whose importance comes from the extraordinary circumstances surrounding their creation. The 1966 Washington quarter belongs to the second category. At first glance, it may look like an ordinary quarter with no mint mark, a date that has been sitting quietly in collections for decades. But this particular year represents one of the most dramatic periods in modern United States coinage, because America was struggling with a severe shortage of circulating coins at the exact moment when the traditional silver composition of the quarter was being abandoned. When you hold a 1966 quarter, you are looking at a product of that transformation. The absence of a mint mark is not automatically evidence of a rare mistake, because the United States Mint deliberately removed mint marks from circulating coins during the coin shortage of the mid-1960s. To understand why the 1966 quarter exists in the form we recognize today, we have to return to the years immediately before it was struck. The traditional Washington quarter had been introduced in 1932 to honor the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and after becoming a regular circulating denomination in the mid-1930s, it became one of the most familiar pieces of American money. For decades, the quarter was made from 90% silver and 10% copper. That composition gave the coin intrinsic precious metal value in addition to its face value. But by the early 1960s, the economics of silver and the behavior of the public were creating a serious problem for the nation's coinage system. The price of silver was rising, and Americans increasingly had an incentive to remove silver coins from circulation. At the same time, economic growth and increased commercial activity meant that businesses needed enormous quantities of coins for everyday transactions. People were saving coins, banks were struggling to maintain adequate supplies, and the mint was under pressure to manufacture more money than the existing system could comfortably provide. President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration faced the problem as part of a much larger economic and political environment. Johnson had entered the White House after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and had won a landslide election in 1964. His administration was pursuing the ambitious domestic agenda known as the Great Society, including Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights legislation, anti-poverty programs, education initiatives, and urban development. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented landmark changes in American law, while the nation was also confronting deep racial tensions and major social protests. Meanwhile, American involvement in Vietnam was expanding rapidly. By 1966, the conflict had become a central feature of national life, with more American troops being sent overseas and growing debate over the war's purpose and cost. All of these developments formed the background against which the humble quarter was being redesigned and remade. The coin shortage itself was not an isolated problem. It was a reflection of economic behavior and changing confidence in money. Silver prices had been increasing for years, and Americans understood that the silver contained in older coins could eventually become worth more than their face value. That created a powerful incentive to save quarters, dimes, and half dollars rather than spend them. At the same time, vending machines, parking meters, public transportation, retail stores, banks, and countless. So how rare is the 1966 no-mint mark Washington quarter today? The first thing to understand is that the normal issue is not considered a rare coin simply because it has no mint mark. With more than 821 million examples produced, there are still substantial numbers surviving. An exact count of every surviving coin is impossible because millions remain outside professional grading systems, including pieces in collections, old jars, bank rolls, estate accumulations, and ordinary circulation. The survival population is therefore best understood as an estimate rather than a precise census. Most surviving examples are circulated, and their value is generally close to face value. A worn 1966 quarter may be worth only 25 cents to a small premium depending on its appearance and the buyer. In about uncirculated condition, examples may bring more, particularly if they retain attractive original surfaces. Uncirculated examples become increasingly interesting because collectors look for coins with clean fields, strong luster, sharp details, and minimal contact marks. In certified grades around MS63 and MS64, values can remain relatively modest, while MS65 examples may command several dollars or more depending on market conditions and eye appeal. As the grade rises into MS66 and especially MS67, scarcity becomes far more important. The highest grade examples are difficult to locate because modern clad coins are extremely vulnerable to small marks and abrasions during production, transportation, bagging, and distribution. The finest known pieces can therefore sell for hundreds or potentially more depending on certification, rarity within the grade, auction competition, and overall visual quality. But this is where responsible collectors need to separate the normal coin from the exceptional coin. A typical 1966 quarter is not a fortune. A spectacular, professionally certified example at the very top of the grading scale is a different matter entirely. The value is created by condition rarity, not by the simple fact that the date says 1966. And that brings us to the coin sitting in front of you right now. If you have a 1966 Washington quarter with no mint mark, you are holding a small piece of the moment when American coinage crossed from the silver era into the modern clad era. Look at Washington's portrait and remember that this design had already connected generations of Americans to the nation's founding history. Look at the date and remember that it was produced during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, during the Great Society, amid the Civil Rights Revolution, while the Vietnam War was escalating, and while the United States economy was dealing with the consequences of rising silver prices and a nationwide coin shortage. Then turn the coin over and study the eagle, because that familiar image represents continuity at a time when the metal beneath it was changing permanently. If the coin is heavily worn, scratched, stained, or damaged, its value will normally remain modest. But if you find one with unusually clean surfaces, powerful original luster, sharp details, minimal contact marks, and exceptional preservation, that is when the coin deserves closer examination. Also remember that genuine errors and varieties must be authenticated rather than assumed from unusual-looking damage. A strange mark created after the coin left the mint is not automatically a valuable mint error. Professional grading can become especially important when a supposedly ordinary coin appears to be an extraordinary high-grade survivor. The 1966 Washington quarter teaches us one of the most important lessons in collecting. Rarity is not always created at the moment a coin is struck. Sometimes rarity develops over decades as millions of ordinary coins disappear through wear, damage, melting, loss, or simple neglect, leaving behind a much smaller population of exceptional survivors. The 1966 quarter began its life as practical money, designed to keep commerce moving during a national coin shortage. More than half a century later, its greatest significance is historical. It tells the story of a country changing its money while changing itself. And if you discover an unusually pristine example, you may also be looking at something far more desirable, a survivor from one of the most important transitional moments in the history of American coinage. Next up imagine finding a Washington quarter dated 1977 with a small D mint mark beside Washington's portrait, a coin that may appear to be nothing more than another piece of change from the 1970s. But behind that simple quarter is a fascinating story about an America struggling with inflation, energy shortages, political distrust, changing technology, and the difficult transition from the optimism of the post-war decades into a much more uncertain economic era. The 1977 Washington quarter was struck at the Denver Mint, with a reported mintage of 256,524,978 pieces, making the regular issue far too common to be considered rare simply because of its date or mint mark. Yet this is exactly where the story becomes interesting for collectors. PCGS estimates that roughly 89.8 million examples survive across all grades, with about 26.9 million surviving in grades of MS60 or better and approximately 2.69 million at MS65 or better. Those numbers reveal an important truth. The ordinary 1977 D quarter is common, but the finest survivors are a completely different category. PCGS describes the issue as common below MS66, somewhat scarce at MS66, and difficult to locate at MS67, where only a few dozen confirmed examples have been graded. A PCGS MS67 example sold for $459.99 in April 2023, while another MS67 brought $312 at a Stack's Bowers auction that same year. These results do not mean an average 1977 D quarter is worth hundreds of dollars. Most circulated examples remain close to face value, while the real premiums belong to coins with exceptional preservation. So as we examine this quarter, we are not simply looking at an old coin. We are looking at a survivor from a complicated decade, and the closer we get to the finest condition, the more fascinating its story becomes. To understand why the 1977 D quarter was made, we need to step directly into the America of 1977. The country had just experienced one of the most politically turbulent periods in its modern history. The Vietnam War had ended only a few years earlier, the Watergate scandal had damaged public confidence in government, and President Richard Nixon had resigned in 1974. Gerald Ford had followed him into the White House, but was defeated in the 1976 presidential election by Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia who presented himself as an outsider, determined to restore honesty and trust to Washington. Carter took office in January 1977, and one of his first major symbolic acts was granting an unconditional pardon to people who had evaded the military draft during the Vietnam era. The decision was controversial, particularly among veterans and Americans who believed draft evasion should have consequences, but Carter saw reconciliation as part of moving beyond the divisions of the war. At the same time, America was still dealing with the psychological and economic consequences of the energy crisis of the previous decade. The oil shocks of the 1970s had changed how Americans thought about gasoline, heating, transportation, and energy security. Inflation remained a serious concern, and the economy was experiencing the uncomfortable combination of rising prices and unemployment that would become associated with the term stagflation. Carter inherited an economy that was growing in some areas, but struggling with inflationary pressures and energy dependence. The quarter moving through American commerce during this period, therefore, represented far more than 25 cents. It was part of an economy trying to regain stability after years of political scandal, war, energy disruption, and changing consumer expectations. When examining your own 1977 D Washington quarter, the first thing to remember is that appearance matters enormously. Look at Washington's cheek, jaw, hair, and the open fields surrounding the portrait. These areas are highly vulnerable to contact marks, and even small abrasions can prevent an otherwise attractive coin from reaching a top grade. Turn the coin over and examine the eagle's breast, wings, legs, and the broad fields around the reverse design. Look for original mint luster rather than an artificially bright surface. Pay attention to scratches, stains, discoloration, spots, and evidence of cleaning. A coin that has been harshly cleaned may look shiny to the inexperienced eye, but can actually be worth considerably less than a naturally preserved piece. Also inspect the edge and the details of the design for unusual mint-made characteristics, but be careful not to confuse damage that happened after the coin left the mint with a genuine striking error. The 1977 D quarter is not famous as a major rarity simply because of an ordinary date and mint combination, so any claim that a normal circulated example is worth thousands of dollars should immediately be treated with skepticism. The real opportunity lies in identifying exceptional preservation or a genuinely authenticated mint error or variety. Professional certification becomes especially useful when a coin appears unusually sharp and clean because the difference between MS65, MS66, and MS67 can dramatically affect collector interest. PCGS currently lists MS67 examples as the top confirmed grade in its condition census for this issue, with examples at that level commanding far more attention than ordinary pieces. The finest known condition should therefore be described carefully. Rather than promising a fixed maximum value, it is more accurate to say that the highest certified examples can bring hundreds of dollars, with the exact amount depending on grade, certification, eye appeal, and competition at the time of sale. A future exceptional example could always establish a different market result. And now, as you look at this 1977 D Washington quarter, remember what makes it truly fascinating. This was never supposed to be a treasure. It was ordinary American money, created to move through an economy dealing with inflation, energy concerns, political uncertainty, and the aftermath of a deeply divided decade. It carried the image of George Washington while America was entering the final decades of the 20th century, and its copper-nickel-clad composition reflected the permanent transformation of the nation's circulating coinage. More than 256 million were struck at Denver, and millions remain today, so the normal coin should not be presented as an ultra-rare fortune. But time has created another kind of scarcity. Tens of millions may survive, yet the population becomes much smaller as we climb into the highest grades. That is why a worn 1977 D quarter may be worth little more than its face value, while a superb MS66 or MS67 example can attract serious collector attention and reach substantial premiums. If you find one, do not immediately clean it, polish it, or rub away its original surface. Preserve it exactly as you found it, examine it under good lighting, and if it appears exceptionally sharp and untouched, consider professional authentication and grading. The greatest lesson of this coin is that age alone does not create rarity. Mintage alone does not create value. Sometimes the real story is hidden in survival, the millions that disappeared into circulation and the small number that somehow remained remarkably intact. The 1977 D Washington quarter began life as a 25-cent tool of everyday commerce, passing silently through the hands of an America struggling to understand its future. Decades later, its finest survivors have become reminders of that era and examples of how condition can transform an ordinary coin into a prized numismatic object. So the next time a 1977 D quarter appears in your collection, do not dismiss it simply because millions were made. Turn it over, study the surfaces, examine the details, and ask the question every serious collector eventually learns to ask. Not merely how old is this coin, but how well did it survive? Because in the world of Washington quarters, that difference can be the difference between 25 cents and hundreds of dollars. Next up to in the pulling an old Washington quarter from a collection and noticing the date 1984 and the small letter P beside Washington's portrait. At first, it looks like an ordinary piece of American pocket change, but this coin carries the story of a very distinctive moment in United States history. The 1984 P Washington quarter was struck at the Philadelphia Mint during an era when America was experiencing strong economic growth, dramatic political debates, rapidly advancing technology, and a renewed sense of confidence after the difficult economic years of the 1970s. More than 673 million 1984 P quarters were produced, so the regular issue is not rare simply because of its date and mint mark. Yet collectors become much more interested when the coin survives in exceptional condition, because years of circulation have destroyed much of the original population's quality. PCGS estimates that roughly 112 million examples survive across all grades, with about 28.6 million surviving in mint state 60 or better, and approximately 1.5 million at MS65 or better. the population becomes substantially thinner in the finest grades. PCGS reports that MS67 examples are rare, with only a limited number certified at that level, and the finest examples can bring dramatically more than ordinary circulated pieces. An important auction result illustrates the point. A PCGS MS67 1984 P Washington quarter realized $1,440 at a heritage auction in January 2018. That result should never be interpreted as the normal value of a 1984 P quarter. Most circulated examples remain worth around face value or only a modest premium, while value increases as preservation, grade, and eye appeal improve. The real fascination is therefore not simply that this quarter is from 1984. It is that within a population of hundreds of millions, the very best survivors can become condition rarities. PCGS.com. To understand this coin properly, we have to return to America in 1984, a year when the country seemed to be turning a corner after the economic uncertainty of the previous decade. President Ronald Reagan was approaching the end of his first term, and the presidential election of 1984 would soon become one of the most decisive elections in modern American politics. Reagan campaigned on a message of economic recovery, strong national defense, and optimism about America's future. His opponent was former Vice President Walter Mondale, who represented the Democratic Party. The election eventually produced an overwhelming victory for Reagan, but the political debates of the period were serious. Americans were arguing about taxes, federal spending, the national deficit, social programs, military policy, and the role of government in the economy. Yet compared with the economic turbulence of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the national mood had changed significantly. The United States economy was expanding after the severe recession of 1981 and 1982, unemployment was declining, and consumer confidence was improving. Inflation had fallen dramatically from the double-digit levels experienced around 1980, although the country continued to debate the long-term consequences of fiscal and monetary policy. The Federal Reserve under Chairman Paul Volcker had played a major role in bringing inflation under control through tight monetary policy, and the painful recession that followed eventually helped establish the conditions for more stable price growth. By 1984, Americans were increasingly hearing a different economic story. Businesses were expanding, consumers were spending again, and the technology sector was beginning to transform everyday life. The 1984 P quarter was born into that environment, not as a commemorative object, but as working currency intended to keep the nation's everyday commerce moving. The economic role of the quarter becomes much easier to appreciate when we remember how different daily life was in 1984. Americans still relied heavily on cash for ordinary purchases. Credit cards were becoming more common, but they had nowhere near the dominance they would eventually achieve. Electronic payments were far less sophisticated, online shopping did not exist as a normal consumer activity, and there were no smartphones capable of replacing physical wallets. A quarter could be used at a vending machine, parking meter, laundromat, arcade, convenience store, restaurant, or supermarket. It was small enough to carry easily, but large enough to have meaningful purchasing power in everyday transactions. The United States Mint, therefore, had to manufacture quarters in enormous quantities. The 1984 P quarter was struck in the familiar copper-nickel-clad composition introduced during the coinage transformation of the 1960s. Beneath its silver-colored exterior was a copper core, creating the layered structure that had become standard for circulating quarters. The coin retained the famous Washington design associated with sculptor John Flanagan, with Washington facing left on the obverse and the eagle dominating the reverse. The P mint mark identified Philadelphia, and by 1984, the mint had returned to using mint marks on circulating coins after the unusual no mint mark policy of the mid-1960s and early 1970s. The quarter was approximately 24.3 millimeters in diameter and weighed about 5.67 grams. Its reeded edge remained an important part of the design and helped distinguish it from other denominations. Every 1984 P quarter was therefore an industrial product of a sophisticated national system. Copper and nickel were transformed into planchets, Dies transferred the Washington design under enormous pressure, and finished coins were distributed through the banking system into communities across the country. The result was a quarter designed for usefulness, not rarity. But 1984 was also a remarkable year culturally and technologically, and the coin quietly. And finally, when you look at the 1984 Washington quarter, think beyond the number stamped into the metal. Think about an America emerging from a difficult economic period and entering a decade of renewed confidence. Think about Ronald Reagan's presidency, Paul Volcker's battle against inflation, the coming presidential election, the expanding technology revolution, the Los Angeles Olympics, and the continuing Cold War. Think about how radically everyday life has changed since 1984, while the basic quarter remained remarkably familiar. This coin was never intended to become a treasure. It was created to perform an ordinary economic function, to help Americans buy things, receive change, operate machines, and conduct daily business. Yet time has given certain survivors a completely different identity. Hundreds of millions were struck, millions remain, and the normal circulated example is still common. But when you move into the highest grades, the population narrows sharply, and the best-preserved specimens become condition rarities. That is why a worn 1984 quarter should not be advertised as an automatic fortune, while an extraordinary certified MS-67 example can legitimately attract serious collector interest and substantial money. If you discover one that looks unusually clean, do not polish it, wipe it aggressively, or attempt to make it brighter. Preserve its original surface and consider professional grading if its condition appears exceptional. The real lesson of the 1984 Washington quarter is that rarity can emerge long after a coin leaves the mint. A coin can begin its life as one of hundreds of millions, and through decades of loss, wear, damage, and neglect, leave behind only a small group of exceptional survivors. That is the journey from pocket change to collectible treasure. The 1984 quarter may have been designed for everyday America, but its finest surviving examples now offer collectors something entirely different. A physical connection to a fascinating year in American history, and a reminder that sometimes the most valuable coin in an old collection is not the one with the smallest mintage, but the one that survived the longest in extraordinary condition. Next up to imagine reaching into an old collection and finding a Washington quarter dated 1988, with a small mint mark beside Washington's portrait. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary piece of pocket change, but this coin comes from a fascinating period in American history, when the United States was experiencing a powerful combination of economic expansion, technological change, political transformation, and Cold War tension. The 1988 Washington quarter was struck at the Philadelphia Mint, and the regular issue had a mintage of 562,052,000 pieces. That enormous production figure immediately tells us something important. The normal 1988 quarter is not rare simply because of its date and mint mark. In fact, PCGS estimates that roughly 196.7 million examples survive across all grades, including about 59 million at MS-60 or better, and approximately 5.9 million at MS-65 or better. Yet the story changes dramatically when we climb toward the finest grades. PCGS records MS-67 examples at the top of its condition census, and a certified MS-67 example achieved an auction price of $750 in November 2021. PCGS also lists a current guide value of $2,500 for that specific top-grade category, although guide values and actual auction prices can change considerably. This distinction is extremely important. A circulated 1988 quarter is generally an ordinary coin worth around face value, while a spectacular high-grade survivor can become a serious collectible. So when you see the words, rare 1988 quarter, the real story is not that every coin from this year is rare. The story is that among hundreds of millions originally struck, the exceptional survivors with outstanding preservation are much harder to find. PCGS.com. To understand why the 1988 quarter was produced, we have to travel back to the America of the late 1980s, a country that looked very different from the United States of today. Ronald Reagan was serving his second presidential term, but his administration was approaching its conclusion. The 1988 presidential campaign was already becoming a major national event, with Vice President George H.W. Bush representing the Republican Party against Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis, then governor of Massachusetts. Reagan's presidency had been defined by tax policy, deregulation, a large military buildup, and a strong anti-Soviet foreign policy. But by 1988, the relationship between Washington and Moscow was changing. Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had held a series of historic meetings, and arms control negotiations had created a sense that the Cold War might be moving toward a less dangerous phase. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty had been signed in 1987, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles, and Americans were beginning to see signs that the decades-long confrontation with the Soviet Union might eventually end. Yet the nation was also dealing with serious domestic issues. The federal budget deficit remained substantial, debates over taxation and government spending continued, and the stock market crash of October 1987 had shaken financial markets. Although the American economy did not collapse into a prolonged depression after the crash, the event reminded investors and ordinary citizens that the extraordinary economic optimism of the 1980s had limits. Inflation, which had been one of the major economic problems of the 1970s and early 1980s, was much lower than it had been earlier in the decade, and unemployment had fallen significantly from its early 1980s peak. The 1988 peak quarter therefore entered circulation during an America that was economically more confident than the country had been a decade earlier, but still wrestling with questions about debt, financial markets, government policy, and the future direction of the economy. If you have a 1988 peak quarter in your possession, the next question is whether your example has the kind of preservation that could make it interesting. Begin with Washington's cheek and jaw, because these broad raised areas can collect contact marks very easily. Move into the open fields around his portrait and examine them under strong, angled light. Tiny scratches, abrasions, dull patches, and clusters of marks can all affect the grade. On the reverse, study the eagle's breast, wings, legs, and the surrounding fields. A top-grade coin should have remarkably clean surfaces, strong original luster, and attractive overall eye appeal. Do not confuse shine with quality. A coin that has been polished or harshly cleaned may look bright, but can actually be damaged from a collector's perspective. Originality is important. You should also inspect the date and mint mark carefully and look for unusual characteristics, but remember that post-mint damage is common and should not automatically be described as a valuable mint error. If an unusual feature appears to be genuine, professional authentication is the safest way to establish its nature. For ordinary circulated 1988 peak quarters, realistic values generally remain around 25 cents, with perhaps a modest premium for unusually attractive or lightly circulated examples. Normal mint state pieces can be worth a few dollars, while higher grades can command significantly more. Once a coin reaches the upper MS-65 and MS-66 levels, preservation becomes much more important, and MS-67 examples can bring hundreds of dollars. PCGS records a $750 auction result for an MS-67 example sold in November 2021. Its current guide value for the MS-67 category is higher, at $2,500, but collectors should understand that a guide price is not the same thing as a guaranteed selling price. Actual transactions depend on the individual coin, grading service, market timing, eye appeal, and competition among bidders. The finest known condition should therefore be described in terms of the highest certified grade currently recognized rather than claiming that every 1988 P quarter in that grade has a fixed value. PCGS.com. And now, when you look at this 1988 P Washington quarter, imagine the world into which it was released. Ronald Reagan was still president. George Washington's image remained on the nation's pocket change. The Cold War was entering a historic period of transition. Personal computers were becoming increasingly influential, and American consumers were living through a rapidly changing economy. More than 562 million examples were struck at Philadelphia, so the ordinary coin is not an ultra-rare treasure. Its value today comes from something much more subtle: survival in exceptional condition. Millions of examples have disappeared into circulation, accumulated wear, or suffered the marks and damage that naturally come with decades of handling. The small population that escaped those dangers is what gives the highest grade pieces their appeal. If your coin is worn, scratched, stained, or heavily circulated, it will normally remain a modest value piece of pocket change. But if you discover an example with powerful original luster, exceptionally clean fields, sharp details, and almost no contact marks, stop before cleaning or polishing it. Preserve the coin exactly as it is and consider professional grading if the quality appears truly extraordinary. The 1988 P. Washington Quarter teaches us that the word rare needs to be used carefully. A common date can contain rare condition levels. A huge mintage can produce a scarce population at the top of the grading scale. And a coin created for a simple 25-cent transaction can eventually become a fascinating artifact of American history. The quarter that once passed silently through cash registers and vending machines has now become a window into the late 1980s, a period when America stood between the old industrial economy and the coming digital age, between the Cold War and a new international order, and between traditional cash commerce and the technological revolution that would soon reshape everyday life. That is what makes the finest 1988 P. Washington Quarters so compelling. They are not valuable merely because they are old. They are valuable because they survived exceptionally well, and because every surviving surface carries a small piece of the journey from the Philadelphia Mint to the present day.